Hi everybody, it's Susan from Sunrise Quilt Studio, and today I want to show you how to assemble the Christmas basket quilt. Now I am going to use diagrams from the written instructions to explain this, so I'm hoping it'll make a little bit more sense to you. And you can get those instructions in the description box below. There's a link, so just click on that link and you'll be able to get those instructions. So you notice that in this quilt everything is in diagonal rows, and in this diagram I show you how it's kind of split up into sections. So you've got section A through section E, and we're going to sew each section together and set it aside, and then sew all those sections together. So go ahead and lay out all of your pieces in the order that you want them. Put your blocks in the order that you want them, and go ahead and lay out your sashing and your cornerstones and all the setting triangles and the corner triangles, and then you're ready to get started. So we're going to start with section A, and step A1 we're going to sew a cornerstone to each short end of a sashing strip. So you will have your first little section done, and set that aside for the moment. For step A2 we're going to sew a sashing strip to the sides of that first block there in the corner, and then here is a diagram of that block with a sashing strip on each side. For step A3 you're going to sew that sashing strip that you made in step A1 to the top of the block. For step A4 you're going to sew the setting triangles to each side of the sashing strip, and you want to use the diagrams to make sure you get the placement correct for each one of those triangles, because they don't go the same direction. They're turned, so you can see that here in this diagram. Now for step A5 you want to sew the corner triangle to that unit, and then set that aside, and make sure that you are pressing your seams as you're working through each one of these steps. Now we're ready to work on section B, and for step B1 you want to sew a row of 3 sashing strips, and then you want to alternate those with 4 cornerstones. So you'll have that nice long strip of sashing and cornerstones, and you want to lay that aside. For step B2 you want to sew a row of 3 blocks with sashing strips between them, and then 1 on each end. For step B3 sew that sashing row you completed in step B1 to the top of the blocks, and then you want to sew the setting triangles to each end, and once again follow that diagram for placement of those setting triangles. Make sure everything is pressed well, and then set that section aside. Now we're ready for section C, and step C1 you want to sew 2 rows of 5 sashing strips and alternating with 6 cornerstones. So you're going to have 2 separate sets of sashing strips here, and one's going to one side of the row of blocks and one to the other. So this is the longest row, and it goes from the top left to the bottom right of your quilt. Now step C2 you're going to sew a row of 5 blocks with sashing strips between them, and 1 sashing strip on each end of that row. For step C3 sew a sashing row made in step C1 to the top and the bottom of that row of blocks, and then you want to sew a corner square to each end of the row, and press everything well and set that section aside. We're ready for section D, and in step D1 you want to sew a row of 3 blocks with sashing strips between each block, and 1 on each end. In step D2 sew a row of sashing strips alternating with 4 cornerstones. Step D3 sew the sashing strip to the bottom of the row of blocks. So instead of sewing it to the front or to the top, you're going to sew it to the bottom. And then you want to sew on your setting triangles to the ends of the row and follow your diagram for the placement. Now we're ready for section E. This is our last section, and this is kind of the mirror image of section A. So for step E1, you want to sew a cornerstone to each end of a sashing strip and set it aside. In step E2, sew a sashing strip to both ends of your last block, and then sew the sashing strip you made in step E1 to the bottom of the block. In step E3, you're going to sew 2 setting triangles to the sides of the block, and then sew the corner triangle to the bottom of the block. And press everything well and set that aside. And now you're ready to sew all of those sections together. So to me, it is easiest to sew a couple of sections together at the top and the bottom, and then sew the 2 sections together. So what I did was sew sections A, B, and C together, pressed my seams, set them aside, and then I sewed section D and E together and pressed my seam. And then I sewed those 2 sections together where your section C meets section D. And that kind of helps even out the weight of that quilt, so it's not so difficult to manage under the sewing machine. So once you have that all sewn together, you press your seams and press your top real well, and then you're ready to do your borders. Measure your quilt top through the center, and you're going to go from top to bottom, so vertically, and then you're going to cut your border strips to that length. Or what I do is I will leave my strip a little bit longer, and I'll just place a pin to mark that measurement. So I think mine was 54 inches, so I measured my border strip to 54 inches and placed a pin. And that gives me a little extra fabric in case I mismeasured the quilt, and that way I don't have to sew on another piece. And then you're ready to start attaching your borders, and I have some video here showing you how I did that. I'm going to fold the top in half, and it should wind up at the point of that middle block, which it does. And then I see I've got some little tips that I can snip off, so I'll get rid of them. Okay, so this is the center. So I'll place a pin here. And then I'm going to fold the end towards that pin and line it up. And then stretch it out, and then I know this is the quarter mark on this side, and then I'll do the same on the other side. And then I'll make the quarter marks on the border piece, and then so match those marks up and pin, and then place pins in between each of those marks to get my quilt border even across the quilt. And I'm going to leave the tail because in case I need a little bit extra or I've measured incorrectly, then I've got a little safety net there. So now I'm going to measure the border. I already measured the quilt is 54 inches wide, so I already measured that. So that's this point here. So I'm going to line this up and then place a pin here and bring the end to that pin, mark it here, and do the same on the other side. So here is a picture of the completed quilt, and I think it turned out really well. So I'm real happy with this one, as well as the first sample one that I made. So I hope you will give this project a try, and I hope you find out that sewing tops on point aren't as difficult as they look. Thanks for watching. For more quilting ideas, click on the video links. And to keep up with my latest projects, click on the subscribe button. I hope to see you again soon.